Abolitionism in the United States was the movement before and during the American Civil War to end slavery, whether formal or informal, in the United States. In the Americas and Western Europe, abolitionism was a historical movement to end the African slave trade and set slaves free. Later, in the 17th century, English Quakers and evangelical religious groups condemned slavery as unchristian. In the 18th century, perhaps 6 million Africans were taken to the Americas as slaves, at least a third of them in British ships. Abolition was part of the message of the First Great Awakening in the 13 colonies. In the same period, rationalist thinkers of the Enlightenment criticized slavery for violating human rights. James Edward Oglethorpe was among the first to articulate the Enlightenment case against slavery. Oglethorpe banned slavery in the province of Georgia on humanistic grounds, argued against it in Parliament, and eventually encouraged his friends Granville Sharp and Hannah More to vigorously pursue the cause. Soon after his death in 1785, Sharp and More joined with William Wilberforce and others in forming the Clapham sect. Although anti-slavery sentiments were widespread by the late 18th century, the colonies and emerging nations that used slave labor, including the South, continued to do so. After the American Revolution established the United States, northern states, beginning with Pennsylvania in 1780, passed legislation during the next 2 decades abolishing slavery, sometimes by gradual emancipation. Massachusetts ratified a constitution that declared all men equal. Freedom suits challenging slavery based on this principle brought an end to slavery in the state. In other states, such as Virginia, similar declarations of rights were interpreted by the courts as not applicable to Africans. During the following decades, the abolitionist movement grew in northern states, and Congress regulated the expansion of slavery in new states admitted to the Union. Britain banned the importation of African slaves in its colonies in 1807 and abolished slavery in the British Empire in 1833. The historian James M. McPherson defines an abolitionist as one who before the Civil War had agitated for the immediate, unconditional, and total abolition of slavery in the United States. He does not include anti-slavery activists such as Abraham Lincoln or the Republican Party, which called for the gradual ending of slavery. The beginnings. The first attempt to end slavery in the English colonies in North America came from Roger Williams and Samuel Gorton, who made slavery illegal in Rhode Island in 1652. In their view, slavery contradicted their Protestant beliefs. However, this anti-slavery law was disregarded in 1700 when the colony became involved in the slave trade. In the 18th century, Thomas Jefferson and some of his contemporaries had plans to abolish slavery. Despite the fact that Jefferson was a lifelong slaveholder, he had included strong anti-slavery language in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, but other delegates took it out. Benjamin Franklin, also a slaveholder for most of his life, was a leading member of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, the first recognized organization for abolitionists in the United States. Following the Revolutionary War, northern states abolished slavery, beginning with the 1777 Constitution of Vermont, followed by Pennsylvania's Gradual Emancipation Act in 1780. While some of these laws were gradual, these state jurisdictions enacted the first abolition laws in the entire New World. Other states with more of an economic interest in slaves, such as New York and New Jersey, also passed gradual emancipation laws, but by 1804, all the northern states had abolished it. Some slaves continued in servitude for 2 more decades, but most were freed. In addition to this, individual slaveholders, particularly in the Upper South, manumitted slaves, sometimes in their wills. Many noted they had been moved by the revolutionary ideals of the equality of men. The number of free blacks as a proportion of the black population increased from less than 1% to nearly 10% from 1790 to 1810 in the Upper South as a result of these actions. As president, on March 2, 1807, Jefferson signed the act prohibiting importation of slaves, and it took effect in 1808. Which was the earliest allowed under the Constitution. In 1820, he privately supported the Missouri Compromise, believing it would help to end slavery, but his views on slavery were complicated, and possibly contradictory. His will freed only a small fraction of Monticello's slaves in the 1850s. In the 15 states constituting the American South, slavery was legal. While it was fading away in the cities and border states, it remained strong in plantation areas that grew cash crops such as cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco or hemp. By the 1860 United States Census, the slave population in the United States had grown to 4 million. American abolitionism was based in the North, and white Southerners alleged it fostered slave rebellion. The white abolitionist movement in the North was led by social reformers, especially William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and writers such as John Greenleaf Whittier and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Black activists included former slaves such as Frederick Douglass, and free blacks such as the brothers Charles Henry Langston and John Mercer Langston, who helped found the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. Some abolitionists said that slavery was criminal and a sin. They also criticized slave owners of using black women as concubines and taking sexual advantage of them. The Republican Party wanted to achieve the gradual extinction of slavery by market forces, because its members believed that free labor was superior to slave labor. Southern leaders said the Republican policy of blocking the expansion of slavery into the West made him second-class citizens, and challenged their autonomy. With the 1860 presidential victory of Abraham Lincoln, 7 Deep South states whose economy was based on cotton and slavery decided to secede and form a new nation. The American Civil War broke out in April 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. When Lincoln called for troops to suppress the rebellion, 4 more slave states seceded. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves held in the Confederate States, and all the border states began their own emancipation programs. Thousands of slaves escaped to freedom behind Union Army lines, and in 1863 many men started serving as the United States colored troops. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution took effect in December 1865 and finally ended slavery throughout the United States. It also abolished slavery among the Indian tribes. Calls for abolition. The first Americans who made a public protest against slavery were the Mennonites of Germantown, Pennsylvania. Soon after, in April 1688, Quakers in the same town wrote a 2-page condemnation of the practice and sent it to the governing bodies of their Quaker church, the Society of Friends. The Quaker establishment never took action. The 1688 Germantown Quaker petition against slavery was an unusually early, clear and forceful argument against slavery, and initiated the spirit that finally led to the end of slavery in the Society of Friends and in the state of Pennsylvania. The Quaker Quarterly Meeting of Chester, Pennsylvania, made its first protest in 1711. Within a few decades, the entire slave trade was under attack, being opposed by such leaders as William Burling, Benjamin Lay, Ralph Sandiford, William Southby, and John Woolman. Slavery was banned in the province of Georgia soon after its founding in 1733. The colony's founder, James Edward Oglethorpe, fended off repeated attempts by South Carolina merchants and land speculators to introduce slavery to the colony. In 1739, he wrote to the Georgia trustees urging them to hold firm. If we allow slaves, we act against the very principles by which we associated together, which was to relieve the distresses whereas, now we should occasion the misery of thousands in Africa, by setting men upon using arts to buy and bring into perpetual slavery the poor people who now live there free. The struggle between Georgia and South Carolina led to the first debates in Parliament over the issue of slavery, occurring between 1740 and 1742. The Society for the Relief of Free Negroes and Lawfully Held in Bondage was the first American abolition society, formed the 14th of April 1775, in Philadelphia, primarily by Quakers. The society suspended operations during the Revolutionary War and was reorganized in 1784, with Benjamin Franklin as its first president. Rhode Island Quakers, associated with Moses Brown, were among the first in America to free slaves. Benjamin Rush was another leader, as were many Quakers. John Woolman gave up most of his business in 1756 to devote himself to campaigning against slavery along with other Quakers. One of the first articles advocating the emancipation of slaves and the abolition of slavery was written by Thomas Paine, titled African Slavery in America. It appeared on the 8th of March 1775 in the postscript to the Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser, more popularly known as the Pennsylvania Magazine, or American Museum. Abolition in the North. Beginning with Vermont in 1777, most states north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line abolished slavery. These state jurisdictions enacted the first abolition laws in the entire New World. Slavery in Massachusetts was abolished by the judiciary. Since the Constitution declared all men to have rights, slavery was unenforceable. Emancipation in many free states was gradual. Those who were slaves often remained slaves, but children of slaves were born free. Transition arrangements were made, partially to prevent abuses. New York and Pennsylvania, for example, still listed a few slaves in their 1840 census returns, and a small number of black slaves were held in New Jersey in 1860 as perpetual apprentices. At the United States Constitutional Convention of 1787, delegates debated over slavery, finally agreeing to allow states to permit the international trade for at least 20 years. By that time, all the states had passed individual laws abolishing or severely limiting the international buying or selling of slaves. Through the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Congress of the Confederation prohibited slavery in the territories northwest of the Ohio River. The importation of slaves into the United States was officially banned on the 1st of January 1808. No action was taken on the nation's internal domestic slave trade. The principal organized bodies to advocate this reform were the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and the New York Manumission Society. The latter was headed by powerful politicians, John J. Alexander Hamilton, later Federalists, and Aaron Burr, later the Democratic-Republican Vice President of the United States. New York did enact a bill in 1799 that ended slavery over time in 1806. President Thomas Jefferson denounced the international slave trade and called for a law to make it a crime. He told Congress in his 1806 annual message, such a law was needed to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights, which the morality, the reputation, and the best of our country have long been eager to prescribe. Congress in 1807 did outlaw the international slave trade, effective January 1, 1808. The result was a reduction of over 90% in the volume of the slave trade from Africa to the U.S. About 1,000 slaves a year were illegally brought into the United States. Manumission by Southern owners. After 1776, Quaker and Moravian advocates helped persuade numerous slaveholders in the Upper South to free their slaves. Manumissions increased for nearly 2 decades. Many individual acts of manumission freed thousands of slaves. Slaveholders freed slaves in such number that the percentage of free Negroes in the Upper South increased sharply from 1 to 10%. with most of that increase in Virginia, Maryland and Delaware. By 1810, 3/4 of blacks in Delaware were free. The most notable of men offering manumission was Robert Carter III of Virginia, who freed more than 450 people by deed of gift, filed in 1791. This number was more slaves than any single American had freed or would ever free. Often slaveholders came to their decisions by their own struggles in the Revolution. Their wills and deeds frequently cited language about the equality of men supporting their manumissions. Slaveholders were also encouraged to do so because the economics of the area was changing. They were shifting from labor-intensive tobacco culture to mixed crop cultivation and did not need as many slaves. The free black families began to thrive, together with African Americans free before the Revolution. By 1860, 91.7% of the blacks in Delaware were free, and 49.7% of the blacks in Maryland were free. Such early free families often formed the core of artisans, professionals, preachers and teachers in future generations. Western territories. During the congressional debate on the 1820 Tallmadge Amendment, which sought to limit slavery in Missouri as it became a state, Rufus King declared that laws or compacts imposing any such condition, slavery, upon any human being are absolutely void, because contrary to the law of nature, which is the law of God, by which he makes his ways known to man, and is paramount to all human control. The amendment failed and Missouri became a slave state. According to the historian David Bryan Davis, this may have been the first time in the world that a political leader openly attacked slavery's perceived legality in such a radical manner. Beginning in the 1830s, the U.S. Postmaster General refused to allow the males to carry abolition pamphlets to the South. Northern teachers suspected of abolitionism were expelled from the South, and abolitionist literature was banned. Southerners rejected the denials of Republicans that they were abolitionists. They pointed to John Brown's attempt in 1859 to start a slave uprising as proof that multiple Northern conspiracies were afoot to ignite slave rebellions. Although some abolitionists did call for slave revolts, no evidence of any other Brown-like conspiracy has been discovered. The North felt threatened as well, for as Eric Fone concludes, Northerners came to view slavery as the very antithesis of the good society, as well as a threat to their own fundamental values and interests. The famous, fiery, abolitionist, Abby Kelly Foster, from Massachusetts, was considered an ultra-abolitionist who believed in full civil rights for all black people. She held to the views that the freed slaves would colonize Liberia. Parts of the anti-slavery movement became known as Abby Kellyism. She recruited Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone to the movement. Effingham Capron, a cotton and textile scion, who attended the Quaker meeting where Abby Kelly Foster and her family were members, became a prominent abolitionist at the local, state, and national levels. The local anti-slavery society at Uxbridge had over 1/4 of the town's population as members. Colonization and the founding of Liberia. In the early part of the 19th century, a variety of organizations were established that advocated relocation of black people from the United States to places where they would enjoy greater freedom. Some endorsed colonization, while others advocated emigration. During the 1820s and 1830s, the American Colonization Society was the primary vehicle for proposals to return black Americans to freedom in Africa, regardless of whether they were native-born in the United States. It had broad support nationwide among white people, including prominent leaders such as Abraham Lincoln, Henry Clay and James Monroe, who considered this preferable to emancipation. Clay said that due to unconquerable prejudice resulting from their color, they, the blacks, never could amalgamate with the free whites of this country. It was desirable, therefore, as it respected them, and the residue of the population of the country, to drain them off. Many African Americans opposed colonization, and simply wanted to be given the rights of free citizens in the United States. One notable opponent of such plans was the wealthy free black abolitionist James Forten of Philadelphia. After attempts to plant small settlements on the coast of West Africa, the ACS established the colony of Liberia in 1821–22. Over the next 4 decades, it assisted thousands of former slaves and free black people to move there from the United States. The disease environment they encountered was extreme, and most of the migrants died fairly quickly. Enough survived to declare independence in 1847. American support for colonization waned gradually through the 1840s and 1850s, largely because of the efforts of abolitionists to promote emancipation of slaves and the granting of United States citizenship. The Americo-Liberians established an elite who ruled Liberia continuously until the military coup of 1980. Emigration of free Africans back to their continent of origin was thought of since the Revolutionary War. After Haiti became independent, the nation tried to recruit African Americans to migrate there after it re-established trade relations with the United States. The Haitian Union was the name of a group formed to promote relations between the countries. In West Africa, the Back to Africa movement and actions of President James Monroe led to the founding of Liberia, a settlement for freed Africans to live upon. After riots against blacks in Cincinnati, its black community sponsored founding of the Wilberforce colony, an initially successful settlement of African American immigrants to Canada. The colony was one of the first such independent political entities.